They laughed as they whipped the lowly gardener, leaving him to die of thirst in the dirt. I was the absolutely only one who risked my life to give him a single cup of water. I thought I was just comforting a broken man. I didn't know he was actually the ruthless, almighty Alpha King of the North, until he crashed my cruel sister's betrothal banquet, rejected her completely, and knelt right before my worn-out, muddy shoes. Welcome to Luna's secret library. In this special corner, we are dedicated to sharing the most intense, romantic, and captivating love stories. If you're passionate about tales where destiny and justice intertwine, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our wonderful stories. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the Sterling Manor. Inside the grand stone walls, servants rushed like frightened mice. Tonight, the Northern Alpha was arriving. They called him the Wolf King. He was a ruthless conqueror, and Lord Sterling frantically hoped to offer his eldest daughter as a bride to secure a fragile peace. Abigail knelt on the blistering courtyard stones. She scrubbed the cobblestones until her knuckles bled. She was a Sterling by blood, but treated worse than a stray dog since her mother died. Her youth and undeniable beauty only earned her the bitter envy of her stepmother, Lady Margaret, and her half-sister, Victoria. "Scrub harder, you lazy girl," Victoria snapped. She stood in the shade of a silk parasol, fanning herself lazily. Her heavy velvet dress was entirely unsuited for the summer heat, but she wore it proudly to display her wealth. Abigail kept her head down. She dipped her stiff brush into the soapy bucket. She did not argue. Survival in this pack meant absolute silence. A sharp crack echoed across the garden. Abigail flinched. She turned her head toward the rose bushes. There, an enormous man strained under the weight of a marble fountain base. He was the new gardener. The guards said he was a rogue, a captured wolf without a pack, bought for cheap labor. His clothes were ragged. Dirt and sweat masked his features. A cruel pack enforcer stood over him, gripping a thick leather whip. "Move, mutt," the enforcer barked, bringing the whip down across the gardener's broad back. The man did not cry out. He simply absorbed the heavy blow. His massive muscles coiled beneath his tanned skin. He lowered the heavy marble stone into place with startling precision. Then, he stumbled. The heat was unbearable. He had been lifting stones since dawn without a single drop of water. "Please," a younger servant boy whispered nearby. "He is going to die out here." "Let him," Victoria scoffed, walking past the scene. "He is just a rogue. Dirt beneath our boots. Keep working, all of you." The enforcer chuckled. He dropped his whip and walked toward the kitchen for a cold ale, leaving the gardener slumped against the stone fountain. The man's broad chest heaved. His lips were cracked and bleeding. He looked completely defeated. Abigail watched the other servants avert their eyes. No one moved. Fear ruled the Sterling pack. To show mercy to a rogue was to invite brutal punishment. But Abigail could not look away. A strange warmth fluttered in her chest. It was not just pity. It was a deep, unexplainable pull toward the broken man in the dirt. She looked around quickly. The courtyard was momentarily empty. The sun glared off the white stones. Without a second thought, Abigail dropped her scrubbing brush. She hurried to the old stone well in the quiet corner of the garden. She drew up a wooden bucket of fresh, ice-cold water. She filled a clean clay cup to the absolute brim. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she walked toward him. The man was huge up close. Even kneeling in the dirt, his shoulders were broad enough to block out the sun. Thick scars crisscrossed his arms, telling silent stories of countless battles. Abigail knelt beside him. The heat radiating from his large body was intense. "Here," she whispered. Her voice was soft, melodic, cutting through the heavy summer air. The man stiffened. He did not look up immediately. He seemed to expect another blow from the whip. "Drink it quickly," Abigail urged, holding the cup closer. "Before the guards return." Slowly, the gardener lifted his head. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. Beneath the grime and sweat, his face was striking. A strong, unyielding jawline. Sharp, aristocratic cheekbones. But it was his eyes that froze her in place. They were not the dull eyes of a broken rogue. They were a piercing, vibrant amber. The color of molten gold. They held power, intelligence, and an ancient, quiet fury. For a moment, the air between them vanished. The loud cicadas faded into nothingness. The oppressive heat disappeared. There was only him. Only those glowing golden eyes locking onto hers. He reached out. His large, calloused fingers brushed against hers as he took the clay cup. The brief contact sent a jolt of electricity up Abigail's arm. She shivered despite the blazing sun. He brought the cup to his lips and drank deeply. He drained the water in seconds, his sharp gaze never leaving her face. He studied her. He took in her ragged dress, her blistered hands, and the quiet defiance hidden in her bright eyes. He inhaled slowly, memorizing her scent, an intoxicating mix of wild jasmine and summer rain. "Why?" his voice rumbled. It was deep, gravelly, and commanding. Not the voice of a servant. The voice of a king. "You were thirsty," Abigail replied simply. She took the empty cup from his massive hands. "No one deserves to suffer." "They walked past me," he said, his golden eyes narrowing. "They laughed. But you stopped." "I know what it feels like to be invisible," she whispered, a hint of sadness touching her gentle smile. "Stay in the shade." "I must go." She stood up quickly, hearing the heavy footsteps of the enforcer returning from the kitchen. Abigail hurried back to her soapy bucket, bowing her head just as the guard rounded the corner. From the dark shadows of the rose bushes, the gardener watched her walk away. The weariness was entirely gone from his posture. He stood up slowly, towering over the garden walls. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He was Caleb. The alpha of the northern woods. The most feared wolf on the continent. He had infiltrated the Sterling Manor disguised as a laborer to scout their defenses before the evening banquet. He wanted to see their true nature when they thought no one important was watching. He had seen their cruelty, their arrogance, and their rot. He was fully prepared to burn the manor to the ground tonight. But then, she had walked toward him. A single drop of kindness in a desert of cruelty. Caleb inhaled deeply, letting her jasmine scent settle into his lungs. His inner wolf stirred within him, restless and intensely possessive. The beast that had been coldly dormant for decades suddenly roared to life. "Mine," the wolf growled. Tonight, Lord Sterling would offer him a bride. Tonight, the Sterling pack would expect a political alliance. Caleb smiled. It was a dangerous, feral smile that promised destruction. He would accept a bride tonight. But it would not be the pampered daughter in the heavy velvet dress. He would claim the girl with the blistered hands who offered water to a dying man. He would claim Abigail, and he would gladly destroy anyone who dared to stand in his way. The grand hall of the Sterling Manor glittered with 1,000 burning candles. Lord Sterling stood nervously at the head of the massive, intricately carved oak table. He wiped beads of cold sweat from his balding forehead with a trembling silk handkerchief. Victoria stood right beside him, draped in a suffocating gown of rich crimson silk and heavy jewels. She practiced a calculated, seductive smile in the reflection of a polished silver platter. Lady Margaret adjusted Victoria's sparkling diamond necklace with greedy, trembling fingers. "Tonight, you will finally become the absolute Queen of the North," Lady Margaret whispered fiercely. Abigail stood silently and completely unnoticed in the darkest, coldest corner of the vast room. She wore a simple, faded grey cotton dress that barely covered her worn, scuffed leather shoes. Her only job tonight was to hold a heavy silver pitcher of sweet wine and remain entirely invisible. The massive iron-wrought doors of the banquet hall suddenly blasted open with a deafening crash. A freezing, terrifying wind howled violently through the room, extinguishing half the flickering candles in an instant. Heavy, deliberate, and deeply intimidating footsteps echoed loudly on the polished marble floor. Every servant and heavily armed guard in the room immediately dropped to their knees in sheer, unadulterated terror. Caleb walked slowly into the remaining flickering light, no longer looking anything like a broken, dusty laborer. He was dressed in immaculate, midnight black garments heavily trimmed with thick, dark winter fur. A heavy, ancient silver chain rested prominently across his broad, imposing, and muscular chest. His striking golden eyes blazed with a terrifying, ancient power that commanded instant and absolute submission from everyone present. Two massive, battle-scarred dire wolves flanked him closely, their razor-sharp teeth bared in a silent, deadly warning. Lord Stirling dropped instantly to his knees, his entire fragile body shaking uncontrollably in the presence of the true king. "Welcome, Alpha Caleb, almighty king of the north," Lord Stirling stammered pathetically, unable to meet the wolf's terrifying gaze. Caleb did not even spare a single, fleeting glance at the trembling, pathetic lord groveling at his feet. He stopped dead in the exact center of the room, his piercing gaze sweeping aggressively over the terrified crowd. "I have come to claim the bride you promised my pack," Caleb's deep, gravelly voice rumbled dangerously like distant thunder. Lord Stirling practically pushed a beaming Victoria forward into the center of the grand hall. "This is my eldest daughter, Victoria, a flawless, perfectly bred jewel of our pack," Lord Stirling said eagerly and desperately. Victoria stepped confidently forward, offering her most highly practiced, alluring smile directly to the terrifying king. She reached out a delicate, perfectly manicured hand, fully expecting him to bow and kiss it respectfully. Caleb stared down at her outstretched, pampered hand with an expression of absolute, unfiltered disgust. "I do not want your spoiled, painted, and utterly useless doll," Caleb growled, his harsh voice echoing loudly off the cold stone walls. Victoria's fake, confident smile shattered instantly into a pathetic mask of pure shock and deep, burning humiliation. Lady Margaret gasped incredibly loudly, clutching her chest tightly as if she had just been physically struck by a heavy blade. But she is the absolute finest, most educated lady in the entire territory." Lord Stirling protested weakly, panic rising fast in his throat. "She is arrogant, deeply cruel, and entirely useless to a true pack," Caleb stated coldly, dismissing her completely. He stepped right past the stunned and trembling Victoria, completely ignoring her very existence as if she were merely a ghost. His glowing golden eyes locked immediately and intensely onto the darkest, quietest corner of the massive room. He walked straight and purposefully toward the deep shadows where a single, fragile servant girl stood absolutely frozen in shock. Abigail's heart hammered violently and painfully against her ribs as the massive, terrifying Alpha approached her directly. She recognized that incredibly strong jawline and those piercing, molten gold eyes immediately despite his intimidating, regal attire. It was the exact same broken, bleeding gardener she had risked everything to give a simple cup of water to just hours ago. Caleb stopped mere inches away from her, his massive, powerful frame completely towering over her small, trembling figure. The heavy, intoxicating scent of fresh pine, crisp winter snow, and raw, overwhelming masculine power completely surrounded her senses. He reached out incredibly slowly, his extremely large, rough hand gently and reverently touching her rough, blistered cheek. "I want her," Caleb commanded the room, his deep voice filled with an undeniable, fierce, and terrifying possessiveness. The entire banquet hall immediately erupted into a chaotic chorus of shocked gasps and horrified, disbelieving whispers. But she is just a lowly, dirty servant. Victoria shrieked wildly, her shrill voice breaking with intense, uncontrollable jealous rage. Caleb turned his head only slightly, his glowing golden eyes flashing with a highly lethal, terrifying warning that silenced the room instantly. She is the absolutely only person in this entire, rotting manor with a pure soul, Caleb snarled viciously at the wealthy family. He looked slowly back down at Abigail, his harsh, terrifying expression softening beautifully and exclusively only for her. You gave me a life-saving cup of water when your own pack carelessly left me outside to die in the dirt, Caleb said softly, for her ears only. Now, I will gladly and violently tear down this world to give you the entire northern kingdom, he promised, pulling her tightly against his broad chest. Abigail accidentally dropped the heavy silver wine pitcher, the loud metallic clatter completely lost in the roaring, stunned silence of the room. She looked up timidly but bravely into the fierce, highly protective eyes of the single most dangerous man currently alive. For the very first time in her entire miserable life, Abigail did not feel invisible, worthless, or afraid. She felt entirely, completely, and permanently safe, wrapped tightly within the unbreakable arms of the feared Wolf King. Caleb wrapped his thick, luxurious fur cloak around her trembling shoulders, completely shielding her from the cold room and the hateful stares. We are leaving this cursed place immediately, Caleb announced to the silent room, entirely lifting Abigail off the floor and directly into his arms. Lord Stirling opened his mouth to weakly protest, but a low, terrifying growl from one of the massive dire wolves firmly snapped his jaws shut. Caleb walked confidently out of the grand hall with his true mate securely in his arms, leaving the ruined, humiliated Stirling family behind forever. The midnight air was biting cold right outside the Stirling manor walls. Abigail shivered uncontrollably despite the incredibly heavy fur cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Caleb carried her effortlessly to a massive, iron-reinforced carriage waiting patiently in the dark courtyard. For gigantic black horses stamped their massive hooves impatiently against the frozen, hard ground. His heavily scarred pack warriors bowed their heads in deep, unquestioning reverence as their alpha approached. Absolutely no one dared to question the fragile, poorly dressed human girl held securely in his arms. He gently placed her onto the soft, luxurious velvet-lined seats inside the magically warmed carriage. The interior smelled faintly of burning cedar, expensive leather, and his intoxicating, protective scent. Caleb climbed in right after her, his massive, imposing frame taking up the majority of the space. He knocked twice on the thick wooden roof, signaling the heavily armed driver to move immediately. The carriage lurched forward powerfully, leaving the absolute nightmare of her traumatic past behind forever. Abigail pulled her knees tightly to her chest, her heart still racing wildly with sheer disbelief. She sneaked a timid, fearful glance at the terrifying Alpha sitting silently across from her. His glowing golden eyes were already watching her intensely with an incredibly focused, unreadable expression. "Are you cold?" His deep, rumbling voice suddenly broke the heavy, tense silence of the cabin. Abigail shook her head rapidly, entirely too afraid to speak a single, foolish word. She was instinctively waiting for the inevitable, cruel punishment that always followed any mistake she made. She had completely ruined the Stirling family's most important political alliance tonight by drawing his attention. Lord Stirling would surely hunt her down and kill her violently for causing this immense humiliation. Caleb easily noticed her visibly trembling hands and the deep, ingrained fear hidden in her beautiful eyes. He sighed softly, the quiet sound surprisingly gentle coming from such a known, lethal predator. He moved across the spacious carriage very slowly, deliberately giving her time to pull away. He knelt on the polished floorboards right in front of her muddy, heavily scuffed leather shoes. A terrifying king was actively kneeling before a lowly, completely discarded servant girl. "Give me your hands, Abigail," he commanded softly, holding out his massive, heavily scarred palms. She hesitated for a brief, terrified second before slowly extending her painfully injured hands. Her knuckles were completely raw, bruised, and bleeding heavily from scrubbing the harsh stone courtyard. Caleb let out a low, incredibly dangerous growl that made the thick carriage walls vibrate intensely. Abigail flinched violently, desperately trying to pull her hands back in a state of sheer panic. "I am not angry at you, little bird," he reassured her instantly, his iron grip remaining shockingly gentle. "I am completely enraged at the absolute monsters who dared to treat my mate this way." He reached into his heavy black winter coat and pulled out a small, crystal glass vial. It contained a rare, glowing amber salve smelling strongly of crushed, incredibly potent medicinal herbs. He scooped a small amount with his rough thumb and applied it directly to her open wounds. The cooling magical sensation instantly stopped the agonizing, burning pain in her completely raw skin. His rough, calloused thumbs massaged the healing balm into her fragile hands with extreme, focused care. "You officially belong to the Northern Pack now," Caleb stated with absolute, unwavering authority. "Absolutely no one will ever raise a hateful hand against you ever again. If they even try, I will personally and violently tear them apart." Abigail felt a hot, heavy tear finally escape her eye and slide slowly down her pale cheek. She had spent her entire, miserable life trying to be completely invisible just to merely survive. Now, the single most feared monster in the kingdom was treating her exactly like precious, fragile glass. "Why me?" she finally whispered, her quiet voice cracking slightly with intensely suppressed emotion. "I have no wealth, no political status, and absolutely nothing of value to offer a king." Caleb looked directly up, his glowing golden eyes firmly locking onto her tear-filled, confused gaze. "You offered a dying, broken rogue the absolutely only cup of clean water you possessed. You risked the brutal wrath of your pack to show pure mercy to a complete stranger. That single, selfless act proved your true worth more than all the gold in their rotting manor." He lifted her scarred, trembling hand slowly to his lips and pressed a soft, reverent kiss to her knuckles. The highly intimate gesture sent a wild, entirely unfamiliar shockwave of heat straight to her core. "You gave me water, Abigail. In immediate return, I am giving you the absolute, unbreakable protection of the entire North." The heavy carriage traveled swiftly and silently through the dark, highly unforgiving winter night. By dawn, the flat landscape had entirely changed to towering, highly intimidating snow-capped mountains. The massive, solid iron gates of the northern stronghold loomed imposingly in the cold early morning mist. Hundreds of fierce, battle-tested wolf warriors lined the stone walls, eagerly awaiting their returning alpha. The carriage rolled smoothly into the bustling, heavily fortified, and incredibly massive inner courtyard. Caleb stepped out first, instantly and effortlessly commanding the complete attention of the entire gathered pack. He turned right around and offered his large hand to carefully help Abigail step down from the carriage. She hesitated deeply, intensely aware of her faded gray dress and completely messy, unkempt hair. The tough pack warriors stared in absolute silence, clearly deeply shocked by her weak human scent. Caleb instantly sensed her rapidly rising panic and immediately pulled her very tightly against his side. He wrapped a highly protective, unyielding arm around her waist, daring absolutely anyone to challenge his choice. "Listen to me carefully, all of you," Caleb roared loudly, his undeniable alpha command echoing off the stone walls. Every single warrior immediately dropped their aggressive gaze and quickly exposed their necks in absolute submission. "This is Abigail, your true queen and the completely undisputed Luna of the Northern Pack. Her quiet word is absolute law, her physical safety is your highest priority, and her enemies are now ours." A completely deafening, thunderous cheer quickly erupted from the fierce warriors, welcoming their new Luna. Abigail stared at the loudly cheering crowd, completely overwhelmed by their instant, fierce loyalty. She looked quickly up at Caleb, finding him already looking deeply down at her with a highly proud smile. The entirely frightened, severely abused servant girl from the Sterling Manor was now officially dead. She was now the heavily guarded, deeply cherished mate of the most dangerous alpha in existence. And Caleb was already secretly, violently planning exactly how to entirely burn the sterling legacy to ash. The bright morning sun pierced beautifully through the massive stained glass windows of the alpha's private chambers. Abigail woke up slowly on a grand mahogany bed large enough to fit an entire family. She was wrapped securely in the absolute softest silk sheets she had ever felt in her entire life. For a brief, terrifying second, she thought she was back in the cold, damp cellar of the Sterling Manor. She gasped loudly and sat up quickly, her fragile heart pounding frantically against her ribs. Then she saw the enormous stone fireplace crackling warmly across the incredibly luxurious room. She remembered the harrowing carriage ride, the glowing healing salve, and the terrifying wolf king who claimed her. The heavy oak door opened softly, and Caleb walked in carrying a large silver tray of fresh food. He had discarded his heavy winter cloak, wearing only a simple dark tunic that clung tightly to his muscular chest. His glowing golden eyes immediately locked onto her terrified face, instantly softening with pure, unfiltered affection. "You are completely safe here, my little bird," Caleb murmured smoothly, setting the heavy tray on a sturdy oak table. He walked carefully over to the edge of the massive bed and sat down slowly so he would not startle her. The absolutely delicious scent of roasted meats, fresh bread, and sweet mountain berries filled the warm room. Abigail realized suddenly that her stomach was aching painfully from days of cruel near starvation. "I brought you a proper breakfast," he said gently, offering her a warm piece of heavily buttered bread. She took it tentatively with trembling hands, still half expecting him to violently snatch it away as a cruel joke. He did not move a single inch, simply watching her eat with a deeply satisfied, highly protective expression. Every single bite tasted exactly like an absolute miracle to the starving, thoroughly exhausted girl. "I do not know how to be a proper queen," Abigail finally whispered, her sad voice barely louder than the crackling fire. "I cannot fight, I have absolutely no magic, and my own pack considered me completely worthless." Caleb let out a low, dangerous rumbling growl that vibrated deeply in his broad chest. "Your old pack consists of absolute, blind fools who carelessly threw away a priceless diamond," he stated firmly. "You do not ever need to fight, because I will ruthlessly slaughter anyone who dares to look at you wrong. You do not need magic, because your incredibly pure heart is the absolute only power this territory requires." A gentle, highly respectful knock suddenly interrupted the quiet, intensely intimate moment between the alpha and his new mate. An older woman with kind, gentle eyes, and elegant silver hair entered the room, holding a pile of beautiful clothes. "This is Beatrice, our most trusted pack healer and head caretaker," Caleb introduced the woman warmly to his mate. Beatrice bowed her head deeply, displaying absolute, unquestioning respect for the fragile girl sitting on the bed. "It is my highest, absolute honor to finally serve you, Luna," Beatrice said softly with a warm, deeply welcoming smile. Abigail felt a massive, emotional lump form quickly in her throat at the genuine kindness in the older woman's voice. Absolutely no one had ever looked at her with basic respect, let alone freely called her an honorable, revered title. "Beatrice will carefully help you bathe and dress," Caleb announced, standing up smoothly to his full, imposing height. "I must attend to some extremely urgent pack business, but I will return long before the sun reaches its peak." He leaned down slowly and pressed a soft, incredibly lingering kiss to her forehead, sending a massive rush of heat through her body. As soon as Caleb confidently left the room, the terrifying, immense presence of the alpha entirely vanished. Beatrice gently and carefully helped Abigail out of the massive bed and led her directly to a steaming copper bathtub. The incredibly hot water was heavily and beautifully scented with relaxing lavender and wild, blooming mountain roses. As Beatrice carefully washed the deep layers of dirt and grime from Abigail's thin body, she saw the horrifying scars. The kind older woman let out a soft gasp of pure, unfiltered horror at the sight of the cruel, overlapping whip marks. The Alpha was completely right to violently take you away from those absolute monsters, Beatrice whispered fiercely and angrily. You are completely safe now, child, and the entire North will bleed before we ever let them hurt you again. After the incredibly warm, deeply healing bath, Beatrice dressed Abigail in a stunning gown of soft, pale blue wool. The rich, expensive fabric hugged her delicate curves perfectly and brought out the beautiful, hidden brightness in her eyes. She brushed Abigail's tangled, messy hair until it fell gracefully in smooth, wildly shining waves down her slender back. When Abigail finally looked closely in the tall, polished silver mirror, she completely failed to recognize herself. She no longer looked anything like a discarded, deeply broken servant girl meant to die alone in the dirt. She truly looked exactly like a beautiful, deeply cherished queen who belonged securely at the side of a powerful king. Meanwhile, in the massive, heavily fortified stone war room below, Caleb was holding a critical council with his top generals. His trusted second-in-command, Silas, stood firmly before a massive, highly detailed map of the entire continent. Silas was a massive, heavily scarred warrior who easily commanded the complete respect of the terrifying northern armies. Our hidden spies report that Lord Stirling is frantically trying to cover up the humiliating events of last night, Silas reported grimly. He is loudly and falsely claiming that you violently kidnapped his daughter's lowly servant in a fit of wild, unpredictable madness. Caleb's glowing golden eyes flashed instantly with a highly lethal, utterly terrifying anger that violently darkened the entire room. He actually dares to insult my true mate's honor just to save his own pathetic, crumbling reputation, Caleb snarled viciously. The incredibly heavy oak table groaned loudly and dangerously under the sudden crushing pressure of Caleb's massive hands. They brutally abused my true mate for years, starved her constantly, and treated her far worse than a stray animal. And now, they actively dare to call her a kidnapped servant to hide their own immense, unforgivable shame. Silas grinned darkly, his large hand instinctively resting heavily on the solid iron hilt of his massive broadsword. Just give the order, Alpha, and we will gladly turn their precious, arrogant manor into a pile of smoking ash by midnight. Caleb stared intensely at the map, his brilliant mind working smoothly with the cold, highly calculated precision of an apex predator. We will absolutely not simply kill them quickly, Silas, Caleb commanded, his deep voice dripping with highly lethal venom. We will systematically and painfully destroy their wealth, their fragile alliances, and absolutely everything they hold dear. I want Lord Stirling to helplessly watch his entire legacy crumble to dust before I finally take his miserable life. Send our fastest, most lethal riders to the eastern borders and cut off their vital trade routes immediately. Let the entire continent know definitively that absolutely anyone who trades with the Stirlings is a sworn enemy of the North. The fierce generals pounded their heavy fists heavily against their chests, completely united behind their terrifying Alpha's wrath. Caleb turned his intense gaze slowly toward the massive stone staircase leading directly up to his private chambers. He had a beautifully broken mate to carefully heal, and an entire corrupt kingdom to violently burn down in her honor. Panic erupted through the once proud halls of the Stirling Manor. Lord Stirling stared blindly at the mountain of unpaid ledgers piled high on his mahogany desk. His sweating hands could barely hold the wax-sealed letters that brought news of absolute devastation. Every major trade route connecting their territory to the east had been violently severed overnight. Merchant ships flatly refused to carry their exported goods out of profound fear of the northern pack. Wealthy political allies who attended the banquet yesterday now actively ignored his desperate pleas for financial help. Lady Margaret paced the grand room, tearing at her pearl necklace in unhinged frustration. We are ruined beyond repair, she shrieked, her face pale with raw terror. Victoria threw a crystal vase against the stone wall, shattering it into 1,000 glittering pieces. This is completely impossible, the spoiled girl screamed, her perfect makeup ruined by bitter tears. That dirty servant girl cannot possibly be the Luna of the entire North. Lord Sterling collapsed weakly into his leather chair, the crushing weight of reality finally settling over him. They had relentlessly abused the true mate of the most powerful alpha on the continent. Now, the ruthless Wolf King was methodically starving them out without spilling a single drop of blood. The manor servants were already packing their meager belongings and fleeing the cursed grounds in droves. Soon, there would be absolutely no one left to protect them from the impending northern wrath. Far away in the majestic northern stronghold, a distinctly different atmosphere thrived. Abigail walked tentatively down the wide stone corridors with Beatrice acting as her loyal guide. She wore a beautiful pale blue wool dress that made her look like a true goddess of winter. Every passing warrior stopped immediately and bowed their heads in deep reverence. They did not look at her with the cruel disgust she had known her entire life. They looked at her with pure adoration because she belonged securely to their beloved king. Beatrice gently guided her toward a large hall located near the tranquil eastern gardens. It was the pack's primary healing ward, designed for injured warriors and sick elders. A painful whimper echoed softly from a small cot tucked into the far corner of the busy room. Abigail's heart broke at the sad sound, making her entirely forget her own lingering anxieties. She hurried gracefully toward the bed, finding a young wolf pup tossing in a feverish sleep. The pup had been injured in a minor border skirmish and was terrified of the approaching healers. Two seasoned medics stood nearby, looking completely helpless against the traumatized pup's frantic thrashing. "He will not let anyone examine his wounded leg," an older healer explained softly to the approaching Luna. Abigail did not hesitate for a single second. She knelt gracefully on the cold floor, right beside the frightened little wolf. She knew exactly what it felt like to be terrified, injured, and utterly alone in a harsh world. She began to hum a very soft, ancient lullaby that her late mother used to sing to her. Her voice was incredibly sweet, melodic, and devoid of any hidden malice. She slowly reached out her small hand and let the frantic pup carefully sniff her fingers. The pup stopped thrashing instantly, completely mesmerized by her calming jasmine scent. Abigail gently stroked the soft fur behind his ears, whispering soothing words of comfort. "You are entirely safe here, little one," she promised softly, her own past pain giving her deep empathy. The fierce little wolf let out a long sigh and slowly closed his golden eyes. He leaned his heavy head directly into her palm, fully submitting to the new queen's gentle touch. The surrounding healers stared in silent awe at the incredibly touching scene unfolding before them. Even the toughest battle-hardened warriors in the room felt tears pricking the corners of their eyes. Their alpha had not just brought home a beautiful bride to decorate his grand throne room. He had brought home the pure beating heart that their fierce pack desperately needed. Caleb stood quietly in the heavy wooden doorway, watching his mate with glowing amber eyes. He had returned early from the war room, unable to bear being away from her any longer. The violent beast inside him settled the exact moment he saw her gentle smile. He watched her tenderly comfort the injured pup, her soul radiating nothing but unconditional love. She was utterly flawless in a world that was often dark and unforgiving. Silas stood right behind the alpha, deeply moved by the quiet strength of their new Luna. "She is exactly what the North has been missing for centuries," Silas whispered with absolute respect. Caleb nodded slowly, his massive chest swelling with an overwhelming possessiveness. He walked into the healing ward, his heavy boots making no sound on the smooth floor. Abigail looked up quickly, her bright eyes lighting up with genuine relief at his immediate presence. She did not flinch when the intimidating alpha knelt carefully beside her on the stone. She naturally leaned directly into his broad shoulder, seeking his familiar warmth. Caleb wrapped his strong arm securely around her waist, kissing the soft crown of her head. "You are doing exceptionally well, my beautiful queen," Caleb murmured against her fragrant hair. Abigail smiled, a breathtakingly radiant smile that illuminated the dim room. For the very first time, she truly believed that she was worthy of this beautiful life. Caleb held her tightly, knowing that Lord Stirling was currently drowning in inescapable despair. He would let the treacherous family rot in their own agonizing ruin for exactly 3 more days. Then, he would personally march south to finish the destruction he had promised his beloved mate. 3 days passed exactly as the terrifying Alpha of the North had promised. The crippling economic blockade had systematically destroyed every single alliance the Stirling family possessed. Inside the warm northern stronghold, Abigail was slowly blooming into a truly magnificent queen. She no longer jumped in terror at the sound of heavy footsteps in the stone corridors. The fierce pack warriors greeted her with deep, booming voices full of genuine affection. Even the most dangerous dire wolves happily rolled onto their backs seeking her gentle touch. Caleb watched her heal beautifully, his glowing golden eyes constantly filled with overwhelming pride. He had initially given her a safe haven, but she had quickly given the entire frozen territory a beating heart. The peaceful morning was suddenly interrupted by a harsh, violently blowing winter blizzard. Silas marched heavily into the grand dining hall, his thick leather boots covered in fresh snow. He bowed respectfully to Abigail first before turning his massive body to address his Alpha. "My king, we have uninvited beggars groveling outside the southern gates," Silas reported grimly. Caleb did not even look up from carefully peeling a sweet winter orange for his mate. "Let the wild winter wolves eat whatever foolish rogues wandered too close," Caleb replied coldly. Silas grinned darkly, exposing his incredibly sharp canine teeth in a lethal smile. "It is not ordinary rogues, Alpha," Silas clarified, his deep voice echoing in the hall. "It is Lord Stirling and his eldest daughter, Victoria." Abigail instantly dropped her heavy silver fork, the loud clatter cutting through the quiet room. A brief, painful flash of deeply ingrained terror spiked quickly inside her fragile chest. Caleb's large, calloused hand immediately covered hers, his warm grip instantly grounding her racing heart. "They look completely pathetic," Silas continued, clearly enjoying his detailed report immensely. "They walked the last 10 miles entirely on foot after their starving carriage horses finally collapsed. The corrupt lord is weeping loudly in the freezing snow, desperately begging for a single audience. He brought the spoiled girl dressed in thin rags, completely stripped of her expensive jewels. He is loudly offering her as a lowly servant or a concubine if it will lift the trade ban." Disgust twisted Caleb's handsome features into a terrifying, highly feral snarl. He stood up slowly, the raw, lethal power radiating from his massive body shaking the wooden table. "I will go out there and personally rip his treacherous head from his miserable shoulders." "No," Abigail said softly, but her clear voice carried immense, undeniable weight. Caleb stopped instantly, turning to look deeply down at his beautiful, brave mate. She stood up gracefully, smoothing the thick, luxurious velvet of her royal blue gown. They did not travel all this way just to face the feared Alpha of the North. They came here to face the daughter they carelessly threw away like worthless garbage. Caleb's golden eyes widened slightly before filling rapidly with absolute, fierce adoration. "As you wish, my perfect queen," Caleb murmured softly. He offered his strong arm to her, bowing his head in pure, unquestioning submission to her will. They walked together toward the massive, towering stone battlements overlooking the main iron gate. The bitter mountain wind howled violently, carrying the freezing snow in blinding white sheets. Down below, 2 miserable, violently shivering figures knelt in the deep, freezing slush. Lord Stirling's face was completely purple from the deadly, biting cold of the north. Victoria was sobbing hysterically, her once perfect blonde hair deeply matted with ice and dirt. "Please, Almighty King!" Lord Stirling screamed blindly toward the high, imposing stone walls. "We are entirely ruined, our people are starving, and we have absolutely nothing left. Take my beautiful daughter as payment, just please spare my miserable, worthless life." Abigail stepped forward calmly, looking firmly down over the thick stone parapet. The heavy winter wind whipped her dark fur cloak around her, framing her like a vengeful goddess. You have absolutely nothing left because you built your entire life on pure cruelty and greed. Her melodic voice was magically amplified by the wind, carrying directly down to the terrified beggars. Lord Stirling froze entirely, his wide, deeply bloodshot eyes locking onto the magnificent woman above him. He recognized that melodic voice instantly, but his mind could not comprehend the majestic sight before him. Victoria stopped crying for a single second, staring up at her former servant in pure, unadulterated shock. "Abigail?" Victoria whispered hoarsely, her teeth chattering violently in the freezing, relentless wind. "That is the undisputed Luna of the northern pack you are addressing, you filthy rat." Silas roared loudly from the wall. He pulled his massive, heavy bowstring taut, aiming a lethal steel-tipped arrow directly at Victoria's chest. Abigail raised a single, graceful hand, and Silas immediately lowered his deadly weapon without question. She looked down at the pathetic, shivering monsters who had ruthlessly terrorized her entire childhood. She felt absolutely no pity for them, but she also felt no burning desire for unnecessary bloodshed. "You once told me very clearly that the weak deserve to die alone in the dirt," Abigail stated coldly. "You happily whipped a dying man because he dared to ask for a single drop of clean water. Now, you kneel in the freezing snow, desperately begging for the exact same mercy you violently denied others." Lord Stirling pressed his purple face directly into the slush, weeping loudly like a beaten, pathetic child. "Please, Abigail, you are my own flesh and blood," he wailed desperately, trying to invoke a forgotten bond. "I am absolutely nothing to you," she replied evenly, entirely severing the invisible chains of her past trauma. "I will not dirty my clean, peaceful lands with your foul, deeply corrupted blood. Turn around right now and walk back to your rotting, empty manor. If you ever cross into Northern Territory again, my loyal wolves will gladly feast on your bones." She turned her back on them flawlessly, not sparing the ruined family another single, fleeting glance. Caleb wrapped his massive, powerful arms around her from behind, burying his handsome face in her warm neck. He let out a loud, terrifying, deeply resonant howl of absolute victory that shook the snowy mountains. The mighty sound was instantly echoed by thousands of heavily armed pack warriors standing on the walls. The deafening, unified roar completely terrified the broken Stirlings, who scrambled desperately to their freezing feet. They fled blindly back into the blinding blizzard, destined to fade entirely into forgotten obscurity. Abigail leaned back peacefully against her powerful alpha, finally, truly, and completely free from her past. The great halls of the northern stronghold were draped in shimmering silver silk and fresh pine. The winter festival, the most sacred celebration of the North, had officially begun under a clear, starry sky. Massive bonfires roared in the courtyard, casting a warm, orange glow against the ancient stone walls. Abigail stood before her polished silver mirror, her heart swelling with a quiet, newfound confidence. She wore a gown crafted from the finest white velvet, embroidered with intricate silver snowflakes that seemed to glow. Beatrice carefully placed a delicate crown of frozen mountain crystals upon her dark, flowing hair. "You look like the very spirit of the North itself, my queen," the older woman whispered with genuine pride. Abigail stepped out onto the grand balcony, looking down at the thousands of warriors and their families below. The crowd erupted into a deafening, unified roar of approval the moment they saw her radiant face. They did not see a fragile human, they saw the woman whose kindness had healed their wounded and their young. Caleb stood at the center of the courtyard, his massive frame radiating an aura of absolute, terrifying power. He was dressed in his full royal regalia, his golden eyes burning with an intense, singular focus on his mate. He held out his hand, and Abigail walked down the grand stone stairs with the grace of a born sovereign. Every step she took was firm, her head held high, the shadows of her past entirely erased by the light. Caleb led her to the base of the great heartwood tree, an ancient white tree that pulsed with a faint, blue light. The air around the tree was thick with ancient, primal magic that made the very ground vibrate beneath their feet. "Tonight, we perform the soul binding," Caleb announced, his deep voice carrying to the furthest edges of the crowd. A collective gasp of shock ripples through the gathered leaders of the surrounding mountain clans. The soul binding was a ritual of absolute commitment, linking two souls together across life and death. It meant that if one felt pain, the other would share it. If one fell, the other would follow. Caleb drew a small, ornate silver dagger and made a tiny, shallow cut on the palm of his massive hand. He looked at Abigail with a silent question, his eyes searching hers for any sign of fear or hesitation. She did not blink. She reached out her hand and allowed him to make the same small mark on her palm. They pressed their palms together, their blood mingling as the ancient tree flared with a blinding, celestial light. Abigail felt a sudden, massive rush of warmth flood through her entire body, reaching into her very soul. She could suddenly feel his heartbeat against her own, steady, powerful, and fiercely protective. She could sense his thoughts, a roaring ocean of devotion and a promise to burn the world for her. Caleb knelt before her in the snow, an act of submission that stunned the visiting foreign dignitaries. He took a ring carved from a single piece of indestructible mountain ice and slipped it onto her finger. "This is the seal of frost," Caleb declared, his voice echoing like thunder through the mountain peaks. "It is the symbol of the highest authority in the north, a power that has never been held by a human. From this moment forward, Abigail's word is my word, and her life is my life. To strike her is to strike the king, to defy her is to invite the total wrath of the Northern Empire." Abigail looked down at the ring, feeling the immense weight of the power she now possessed. She looked back at the fierce warriors, her bright eyes shining with a vision of a peaceful, strong future. "I will not rule through fear, but through the same mercy that brought me here," she spoke clearly and firmly. The warriors pounded their chests in unison, their loyalty to her now as unbreakable as the ice itself. Caleb stood up and pulled her into a fierce, possessive embrace, kissing her deeply before his entire kingdom. The festival erupted into music and dance, a celebration of a union that would change history forever. But as the fires burned bright, a dark shadow was moving in the distant, forgotten lands of the south. A hidden enemy, far more dangerous than the Sterlings, was watching the new queen with envious, hateful eyes. Caleb sensed a flicker of unease through the soul bond and tightened his hold on his mate. He would let her enjoy her night of glory, but he was already preparing for the next war. The silver festival fireworks were still flickering beautifully across the dark, velvet sky. Abigail leaned her head against Caleb's broad, warm chest, feeling his powerful heart beating in perfect sync with hers. The ancient soul binding was pulsing through her veins like a river of liquid gold. She could feel his absolute peace, his fierce love, and a deep, quiet exhaustion from the day's rituals. Suddenly, a sharp, icy spike of pure, unadulterated terror pierced through the shared bond. It was not her fear, it was a cold, predatory shadow lurking just behind the heavy stone pillars. A silent, hooded figure emerged from the absolute darkness like a ghost made of black smoke. The assassin held a long, jagged blade coated in a sickly, glowing green venom, the wolf-bane. Caleb reacted with the blinding, explosive speed of a true alpha king before the blade could touch her skin. He threw his massive body directly in front of Abigail, shielding her completely from the lethal strike. The poisoned blade buried itself deep into Caleb's powerful shoulder with a sickening, wet thud. Because of the soul binding, Abigail screamed in immediate, agonizing synchronicity with her mate. A blinding, white-hot fire erupted in her own shoulder, mirroring the king's brutal wound exactly. Caleb let out a strangled, pained growl and collapsed heavily onto his knees in the freezing slush. The wolfbane toxin acted like 1,000 stinging needles, paralyzing his legendary strength instantly. "Caleb!" Abigail shrieked, catching his massive frame before his head could hit the hard stone. The assassin laughed, a cold and hollow sound that echoed maliciously through the silent courtyard. The mighty Wolf King brought down by a lowly human's shared weakness, the hooded killer hissed. He raised the venomous blade again, preparing to end both their lives with a single, final stroke. But the assassin had made one fatal, irreversible mistake. He had underestimated the fierce, sleeping lioness hidden within the gentle servant girl. Abigail looked up, and her bright eyes were no longer soft or filled with fearful tears. They glowed with a terrifying, ethereal blue light, the raw, ancient power of the frost seal. The soul binding was no longer just a passive link, it became a conduit for her dormant strength. She felt the cold, ancient magic of the northern mountains rushing into her small, fragile hands. "You will not touch him!" Abigail roared, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 winter storms. She thrust her hand forward, and a massive, jagged spear of solid ice erupted instantly from the ground. The ice spear pierced through the assassin's chest before he could even blink his wide, shocked eyes. He was pinned violently to the stone pillar, freezing into a grotesque statue of black smoke and blood. Abigail ignored the dying killer and collapsed back onto the snow, cradling Caleb's gray, sweating face. The toxin was rapidly shutting down his heart, and she could feel his life force fading through the bond. "Don't leave me, Caleb," she sobbed, pressing her bleeding palm firmly against his poisoned wound. She focused every single ounce of her will on the golden thread connecting their two fragile souls. She began to pull the darkness out of him, taking the burning venom into her own resilient human body. It was a suicidal move that no human should have ever been able to survive. But she was the Luna of the North, and the very mountains themselves seemed to bow to her sacrifice. The golden light of the bond flared with a blinding, divine intensity that illuminated the entire fortress. The poison was neutralized by the sheer purity of her devotion and the raw power of their shared blood. Caleb's golden eyes snapped open, the lethal gray tint vanishing as his legendary strength returned. He gasped for air, his hand immediately reaching out to grip her trembling, ice-cold shoulder. "Abigail, you saved me," he whispered, his voice full of a new, deeply humbled reverence. She collapsed against him, her strength entirely spent but her heart finally, completely at peace. They lay together in the quiet snow, two broken souls now fused into one unbreakable, eternal force. The shadow of the south was gone, and the reign of the Wolf King and his human queen was now undisputed. Only one final chapter remained to be written in the annals of the Northern Pack. The midday sun hung in the sky like a giant, burning furnace. The white stone walls of Stirling Manor reflected the heat until the air itself seemed to vibrate. Abigail wiped the heavy sweat from her forehead with a piece of old, coarse fabric. Her knuckles were red and swollen from scrubbing the scorching cobblestones since dawn. She was the eldest daughter of the house, yet she was treated worse than the stray cats in the stable. Lady Margaret stood on the high, shaded balcony, watching Abigail with cold, calculating eyes. Victoria sat beside her mother, fanning herself with a delicate lace fan that cost more than a servant's yearly wage. "The Northern Alpha arrives tonight, and this courtyard must be flawless," Lady Margaret shouted down. Abigail did not look up, knowing that any eye contact would only invite a fresh wave of insults. She dipped her heavy, splintered brush back into the bucket of soapy water. The water was warm and murky, offering no relief from the stifling mountain heat. A sudden, sharp crack of a leather whip echoed across the manicured gardens. Abigail flinched, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Near the overgrown rose bushes, a massive man was struggling under the weight of a heavy stone pedestal. He was the new gardener, a man the guards called a nameless rogue, bought from a passing caravan. His back was a map of old scars, and new welts were blooming across his tanned skin. The head guard, a cruel man named Silas, laughed as he brought the whip down again. The gardener did not scream or beg, he simply tightened his grip on the heavy stone. His muscles coiled like thick iron cables beneath his sweat-soaked, tattered shirt. Even covered in dirt and grime, he possessed a strange, terrifying stillness that made the other servants nervous. "Move it, you useless cur!" Silas barked, kicking a cloud of dust into the gardener's face. The gardener stumbled, his knees hitting the hard, dry earth with a heavy thud. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps, and his lips were cracked and bleeding from thirst. The other servants hurried past, looking away to avoid being targeted by Silas's unpredictable rage. Victoria let out a high-pitched, melodic giggle from the balcony. "Look at the beast," she sneered, pointing a gloved finger at the man in the dirt. "He looks exactly like the filth he was born to shovel." Abigail watched the man's large hands tremble as they gripped the dry soil. She felt a sharp, painful pang of empathy deep in her chest. She knew exactly what it felt like to be hungry, thirsty, and utterly invisible to the world. She looked at her own water bucket, sitting untouched in the small patch of shade. It was her only ration for the day, and the well was a long walk through the guarded kitchen. Without a second thought, Abigail stood up, her legs shaking from hours of kneeling. She picked up the small wooden cup she kept hidden in her apron. She filled it to the brim with the clearest water from the top of the bucket. The silence in the courtyard became heavy and suffocating as she walked toward the fallen man. Silas turned his head, his eyes narrowing as he saw the small, beautiful girl approaching the rogue. "What do you think you're doing, girl?" Silas growled, his hand tightening on the whip. Abigail did not answer. She kept her eyes fixed on the gardener's bowed head. She knelt in the dirt beside him, ignoring the heat radiating from his massive body. "Drink this," she whispered, her voice like the soft rustle of autumn leaves. The gardener froze, his entire body tensing as if he expected a blow instead of kindness. He slowly lifted his head, and Abigail's breath caught in her throat. Beneath the filth and the dried blood, his face was carved from pure, hard marble. But it was his eyes that truly terrified and captivated her in the same heartbeat. They were a deep, molten gold, glowing with a prehistoric power that no ordinary man should possess. For a moment, the world around them vanished entirely. The mocking laughter of Victoria and the shouting of the guards became distant, meaningless noise. There was only the golden fire in his gaze and the trembling cup in her hand. He reached out, his massive, calloused fingers brushing against her soft skin as he took the cup. A jolt of pure electricity surged up Abigail's arm, making her hair stand on end. He drank the water in one long, desperate gulp, his eyes never leaving her face. He studied her ragged dress, her blistered hands, and the quiet dignity in her bright eyes. He inhaled deeply, catching the scent of wild jasmine and rain that seemed to cling to her skin. "Thank you," he rumbled, his voice so deep it vibrated through the very ground beneath her. "Get away from him, you brat!" Silas shouted, finally recovering from his shock. He swung the whip, the leather tip whistling through the air toward Abigail's back. Before the blow could land, the gardener moved with the speed of a striking mountain lion. He caught the whip in his bare hand, the leather snapping taut against his powerful grip. Silas gasped, his face turning a pale, sickly shade of white as he tried to pull the whip free. The gardener stood up slowly, towering over the guard like a vengeful god of old. The aura of a lowly laborer vanished, replaced by a suffocating, predatory dominance. "You will not touch her again," the gardener said, his golden eyes flashing with a lethal light. He let go of the whip, and Silas stumbled back, tripping over his own heavy boots. Abigail stared up at the man, her heart racing with a mix of awe and sudden, overwhelming fear. "Go back to your work," he told her gently, his voice softening only for her. Abigail nodded quickly, her mind spinning as she hurried back to her soapy bucket. From the balcony, Lady Margaret watched the exchange with a deep, uneasy frown. She did not understand what had just happened, but she felt a sudden chill in the desert heat. The gardener went back to his stones, but his posture was no longer that of a broken man. He was Caleb, the Alpha King of the North, and he had seen enough of the Sterling family. He had found the rot in the heart of this house, but he had also found something else. He had found the one soul worth saving in a desert of cruelty and arrogance. Tonight, when he returned in his royal silks, he would not be seeking a political alliance. He would be seeking the girl with the water cup, and he would take her by any means necessary. His inner wolf roared with a possessive, ancient fury that shook the foundations of his soul. The Sterling family thought they were preparing for a wedding, but they were actually preparing for a reckoning. And it all started with a single, clear drop of water given by the only person who cared. Abigail changed her humble life simply because of a bowl of water. If you were in her shoes, would you still extend a helping hand to a dirty stranger when you were in dire straits yourself? Tell me your choice in the comments.